The morning of July 25, 1944, near Saint-Lô, France, Oberst Heinrich Freiherr von Luttwitz crouched in the commander's cupola of his Panther Ausf G as American fighter bombers circled overhead like hawks surveying prey. For 2 years, the Luftwaffe colonel turned Panzer commander had assured his crews that Allied fighter aircraft posed a manageable threat to armored vehicles. Strafing runs were dramatic but rarely penetrating. The .50 caliber rounds sparked harmlessly off sloped armor.
If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today.
Even the occasional bomb run could be survived with proper dispersion and movement discipline. What descended from the summer sky that morning would shatter every tactical assumption built during 3 years of armored warfare. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt had entered combat in April 1943 as a high-altitude escort fighter designed to protect bomber formations over Germany. Its massive Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasp engine, delivering 2,000 horsepower, made it the heaviest single-engine fighter of the war at 17,500 pounds fully loaded. German fighter pilots initially dismissed it as the Jug, too heavy to dogfight effectively, too bulky to match the elegant maneuverability of the Messerschmitt Bf 109 or Focke-Wulf FW 190. The Thunderbolt's 850 caliber machine guns represented formidable firepower against aircraft, but German armor crews had learned through bitter experience in North Africa and Italy that machine gun fire, regardless of caliber, represented nuisance rather than mortal threat to properly armored vehicles. The evolution of Allied fighter-bomber doctrine emerged from desperate necessity rather than strategic planning. By June 1944, Allied forces advancing through Normandy faced German armored counterattacks that threatened to contain the breakout from the beachhead. The terrain of the bocage, small fields bounded by ancient hedgerows and sunken roads, negated Allied advantages in armor numbers and artillery concentration. German Panthers and Tigers could ambush Sherman columns in the narrow lanes where superior Allied numbers became a liability rather than advantage. The 9th Air Force, commanded by Major General Hoyt Vandenberg, received urgent requests for close air support that exceeded the capacity of traditional dive bombers and light attack aircraft. The California Institute of Technology's work on unguided rockets had begun in 1940 under the direction of Theodor von Karman. The high-velocity aircraft rocket project sought to develop a weapon that could be carried in large numbers by fighter aircraft and deliver explosive power comparable to small bombs with greater accuracy at lower altitudes. By 1943, the design had matured into a weapon that would revolutionize ground attack aviation. The HVAR, designated officially as the 5-inch forward-firing aircraft rocket Mark IV, measured 60 inches in length and weighed 141 pounds at launch. The rocket motor contained 37 pounds of ballistite propellant that accelerated the weapon to 1,375 feet per second within half a second of ignition. The warhead options included a 60-pound high-explosive charge, an armor-piercing head, or a practice head for training. The effective range reached 5,000 yards, though most combat launches occurred between 1,000 and 2,000 yards, where accuracy improved dramatically. The engineering challenges of mounting rockets on fighter aircraft had delayed deployment. Early rocket systems on Soviet and British aircraft suffered from dispersion patterns so wide they functioned as area weapons rather than precision strike tools. The HVAR's innovation came from 3 critical design features. First, the rocket body included 4 stabilizing fins machined to precise tolerances that maintained straight flight without the wobble that plagued earlier designs. Second, the zero-length launch rail mounted beneath the wing allowed the rocket motor to ignite while still attached to the aircraft, utilizing the fighter's momentum as initial velocity rather than fighting against it. Third, the electrical firing system tied directly to the gun trigger, allowing pilots trained in aerial gunnery to aim rockets using the same gun sight they used for machine guns. The P-47's robust structure made it an ideal platform for the HVAR system. Each aircraft could carry 10 rockets, 5 mounted on zero-length launch rails under each wing. The additional weight of 1,410 pounds, fully loaded with rockets, reduced maximum speed by approximately 15 miles per hour and decreased climb rate marginally, but the Thunderbolt's power-to-weight ratio remained sufficient for effective combat operations. More critically, the rockets could be jettisoned in flight if the pilot encountered enemy fighters, allowing the Thunderbolt to revert to its air superiority role without penalty. Training for HVAR employment began at fighter bomber schools in England during spring 1944. Pilots discovered that rockets required different aiming techniques than machine guns. The ballistic trajectory of the unguided rocket meant that successful employment required accurate range estimation, proper dive angle, and compensation for wind and target movement. The gun sight's normal depression angle worked adequately for ranges between 1,000 and 1,500 yards, but pilots learned to adjust aim point based on visual cues developed through repeated practice runs against ground targets. The training emphasized that rockets were not precision weapons, despite their improved accuracy over earlier designs. A spread pattern of 3 to 5 feet at 1,000 yards meant that individual tanks might evade single rockets, but concentrated salvos of 10 rockets created a lethal beaten zone that few armored vehicles could survive. The tactical employment doctrine developed through trial and error emphasized several principles. First, HVAR attacks required steeper dive angles than strafing runs, typically 30 to 45 degrees, to bring the rocket trajectory aligned with the target and reduce exposure time to ground fire. Second, rockets were most effective when launched in pairs or salvos rather than singly, creating multiple impact points that increased probability of hitting the target or achieving near misses that could damage tracks, optics, or engine compartments. Third, combination attacks employing both rockets and machine gun fire proved devastating. The rockets would be launched first at ranges between 1,200 and 1,500 yards, followed immediately by machine gun fire as the aircraft closed to strafing range. This combination forced enemy crews to choose between buttoning up against machine gun fire, which reduced their ability to maneuver away from incoming rockets, or remaining exposed to direct fire while attempting to evade the rocket salvo. By early July 1944, the 365th Fighter Group, the 405th Fighter Group, and the 362nd Fighter Group of the 9th Air Force had completed HVAR training and begun combat operations over Normandy. The initial results exceeded optimistic projections. Pilots reported that German armor, which had previously required multiple strafing runs and hundreds of machine gun rounds to achieve mobility kills, could be destroyed or disabled with a single well-executed rocket attack. The psychological impact on German tank crews proved equally significant. Machine gun fire provided auditory warning as rounds impacted armor, allowing crews to take cover or maneuver. HVAR attacks provided no such warning. The rockets traveled faster than sound. The first indication of attack was often the massive explosion as 60 pounds of high explosive detonated against or near the vehicle. The mathematics of destruction were compelling. A single 60-pound HVAR warhead delivered explosive force roughly equivalent to a 105mm howitzer shell. 10 rockets launched in a 2-second salvo represented firepower equal to a battery of 6 105mm guns, firing a time-on-target mission. The 9th Air Force could place this firepower precisely on individual vehicles or small unit formations, with response times measured in minutes rather than the hours required to coordinate traditional artillery support. A single P-47 squadron of 16 aircraft, each carrying 10 HVARs, could deliver 160 rocket attacks in a single mission, roughly equivalent to the explosive power of 27 tons of bombs, but delivered with far greater accuracy and at lower altitudes, where visual identification of targets remained possible even in poor weather conditions. German armored doctrine in summer 1944 still reflected lessons learned on the Eastern Front, where Soviet close air support, while numerous, lacked precision and could be mitigated through dispersion, camouflage, and timing movement to periods of poor visibility. The Luftwaffe's collapse as an effective fighter force meant German ground forces could no longer rely on air superiority or even local air parity. The solution, implemented through hard experience, involved moving armor primarily at night or during weather conditions that grounded Allied aircraft, maintaining maximum dispersion during daylight hours, and positioning anti-aircraft weapons to provide overlapping fields of fire above armored formations. These tactics had worked adequately against strafing attacks and even against bombs. The P-47's 850 caliber machine guns, while impressive in concentration, required direct hits on vulnerable areas to achieve kills against heavy armor. Pilots needed to identify weak spots in tank armor, engine decks, turret rings, commanders' cupolas, and deliver sustained fire from optimal angles. This requirement gave tank crews time to react, to button up hatches, to maneuver into defilade positions, to call for anti-aircraft support. A skilled crew in a well-positioned Panther could survive multiple strafing runs, trading paint and superficial damage for continued operational capability. Bombs represented a different threat category entirely. The destructive power of 500 or 1,000-pound bombs could destroy any armored vehicle through direct hit or very close near miss. But bombs fell according to ballistic trajectories difficult to control precisely. Dive bombers like the P-47s, its previous bombing role required steady, predictable approaches that exposed them to concentrated anti-aircraft fire. Level bombing from medium altitude scattered munitions across areas measured in hundreds of yards, deadly to infantry and soft-skinned vehicles, but manageable for dispersed armor, maintaining proper intervals. The German armored force had developed comprehensive defensive doctrines based on these realities. Armor could survive Allied air power through proper tactics, training, and discipline. The HVAR changed every calculation. The weapon combined the precision of strafing with explosive power approaching that of bombs, delivered from dive angles and ranges that minimized exposure to anti-aircraft fire. More importantly, the rocket's velocity meant it reached the target before defenders could react. From the moment a P-47 rolled into its attack, dive to rocket impact required approximately 8 to 12 seconds. In that interval, a tank crew had to identify the threat, determine the attack angle, decide on evasive action, and execute maneuvers in a vehicle weighing 45 tons. The physics were unforgiving. Operation Cobra, the massive breakout from Normandy, began on July 25, 1944, with the largest close air support mission in military history. Over 1,500 heavy bombers, 396 medium bombers, and 559 fighter bombers attacked German positions in a rectangular area, measuring 5 miles wide and 1.5 miles deep. The Panzer Lehr Division, positioned directly in the bombardment zone, effectively ceased to exist as a combat formation. Of its approximately 100 armored vehicles and assault guns, 70% were destroyed or abandoned. But the devastation from high-level bombing, horrific as it was, had been experienced before by German forces at Stalingrad, in Sicily, across Italy. What had not been experienced was what followed in the days after July 25th, when Allied armored columns broke through German defensive lines and American fighter bombers roamed freely behind German positions, hunting armored vehicles, attempting to establish new defensive positions. The 2nd SS Panzer Division Das Reich, moving north to contain the breakthrough, became a case study in the vulnerability of armored forces to HVAR-equipped fighter bombers. The division had left southern France on June 8th with approximately 150 tanks and assault guns. By the time it reached the Normandy front, attrition from air attack had reduced its armored strength by nearly a third. The survivors had learned to move only at night, to disperse widely during daylight, to seek cover under trees or in villages where buildings might mask thermal signatures and visual profiles. These tactics, while reducing casualties, also reduced the division's ability to mass combat power for counterattacks. On July 29, 1944, elements of Das Reich attempted a daylight movement to reinforce positions near Coutances. The weather had been overcast for 2 days, providing some protection from air attack. When the clouds broke unexpectedly around noon, 9th Air Force controllers immediately vectored available P-47 squadrons to the reported armor. Concentration. What followed was recorded in both American after-action reports and German unit histories. Over the course of 3 hours, successive waves of thunderbolts attacked the stalled German column. The first wave launched rockets against the lead and trail vehicles, effectively trapping the formation on the narrow road. Subsequent waves methodically worked through the column, launching rockets against armored vehicles while strafing soft-skinned trucks and support equipment. Lieutenant Hans von Luck, commanding a reconnaissance battalion attached to the division, described the attack in his post-war memoir. The sound of the approaching aircraft merged with the explosions. There was no time to deploy, no time to seek cover in the fields. The rockets arrived silently, faster than their own sound. A Panther 30 meters ahead simply disintegrated in a ball of fire as multiple rockets impacted simultaneously. The crew never emerged. Von Luck's half-track survived because the P-47s prioritized armored vehicles, but he watched as 12 tanks and assault guns were destroyed or disabled in less than 20 minutes. The survivors abandoned their vehicles and fled into the hedgerows. American ground forces arrived 4 hours later to find the wreckage still burning. The tactical reports filed by American pilots revealed a systematic approach to HVAR employment that had evolved rapidly through combat experience. Pilots learned to attack from multiple directions to prevent German crews from positioning vehicles hull down against a single threat axis. They discovered that rockets launched at steep dive angles penetrated through thinner top armor more effectively than horizontal shots against frontal plates. They developed communications protocols that allowed successive waves of aircraft to build on previous attacks, with later waves targeting vehicles attempting to maneuver away from initial strikes. The learning curve compressed months of doctrine development into weeks of intensive combat operations. German attempts to counter the HVAR threat proved largely ineffective. Increasing anti-aircraft defenses around armored formations provided some deterrence, but P-47 pilots learned to suppress flak positions with rockets before attacking primary armor targets. The robust construction of the Thunderbolt meant it could absorb significant battle damage and return to base. Multiple accounts exist of P-47s returning with hundreds of flak holes, damaged control surfaces, and engine problems, yet still capable of controlled flight. This survivability meant pilots could press attacks through defensive fire that would have destroyed lighter aircraft. Camouflage techniques that worked against visual observation from ground level proved inadequate against aircraft attacking from above. The top surfaces of tanks, painted in dark colors to blend with shadows when viewed horizontally, stood out clearly against lighter soil and vegetation when viewed from overhead. Even vehicles positioned under trees remained vulnerable. The characteristic shape of a tank, the angular turret, the long gun barrel, the distinctive suspension systems created shadows and visual patterns that trained pilots could identify from altitudes above 3,000 feet. Photographic reconnaissance confirmed that skilled observers could distinguish between actual tanks and dummy vehicles created to draw fire. The weight of explosive power deliverable by HVAR-equipped fighter bombers exceeded anything German armored forces had encountered. On August 2, 1944, during the German counterattack at Mortain, the 362nd Fighter Group alone launched over 400 HVAR attacks in support of the surrounded 30th Infantry Division. Each attack delivered 60 pounds of high explosive. The cumulative effect exceeded 24,000 pounds of precisely delivered explosive force, equivalent to the payload of 60 B-17 heavy bombers, but delivered with accuracy measured in yards rather than hundreds of yards. The German 2nd Panzer Division, spearheading the attack, lost 43 tanks and assault guns in 36 hours, primarily to air attack. The counterattack failed not because of insufficient armor or inadequate tactics, but because German forces could not concentrate sufficient combat power in daylight without inviting devastating airstrikes. The psychological dimension of HVAR attacks magnified their physical effects. Tank crews who survived rocket attacks reported that the experience induced a form of helplessness unknown in conventional armored combat. Against enemy tanks, crews could return fire, maneuver for advantage, employ smoke, coordinate with supporting elements. Against aircraft launching rockets, they could only attempt evasion and hope. The random nature of survival intensified the stress. Two identical Panthers positioned 30 feet apart might experience completely different outcomes, one destroyed by a direct hit, while the other remained untouched as rockets impacted harmlessly meters away. This randomness prevented crews from developing effective mental models for survival, unlike ground combat, where skill and experience demonstrably improved survival odds. German commanders recognized that they faced not merely a new weapon, but a fundamental shift in the relationship between air and ground forces. Throughout military history, infantry and armor had represented the decisive arms, with air power providing reconnaissance, interdiction, and limited direct support. The HVAR-equipped P-47 transformed fighter aircraft into tank destroyers capable of achieving kills at rates comparable to or exceeding ground-based anti-tank weapons. A single fighter squadron could disable more armor in 30 minutes than an entire anti-tank battalion could destroy in a day of sustained combat. This capability inversion forced German commanders to reconsider basic assumptions about force employment and tactical planning. Field Marshal Günther von Kluge, commanding German forces in France, reported to Hitler on August 4, 1944, that air superiority had become more critical than numerical superiority in tanks or infantry. His message, preserved in Wehrmacht records, stated that armored movements in daylight had become impossible without accepting catastrophic losses. He estimated that for every tank destroyed by American ground forces, 3 were lost to air attack. The ratio would worsen as American forces broke out of Normandy and operations shifted to more open terrain, where camouflage and concealment became even more difficult. The material evidence supported von Kluge's assessment.
If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this.
Post-war surveys of destroyed German armor in France found that approximately 60% of total tank losses resulted from air attack, with HVAR-equipped fighter bombers accounting for the majority of those kills. The surveys distinguished between different causes of loss through forensic examination of wrecked vehicles. HVAR impacts created distinctive damage patterns, large entry holes surrounded by blast effects, internal explosions caused by detonating ammunition, and in cases of top armor penetration, catastrophic damage to turret mechanisms and crew compartments. The production statistics revealed the scale of American commitment to the HVAR program. By September 1944, American factories were producing over 100,000 rockets per month. The 9th Air Force alone expended approximately 90,000 HVARs during operations in France between July and September. This expenditure rate, roughly 1,000 rockets per day, exceeded the entire monthly production of German Panzerfaust anti-tank weapons during the same period. The industrial disparity that characterized every aspect of the war extended to specialized munitions, with American production capacity enabling tactics that would have been logistically impossible for German forces, even if they had possessed equivalent weapons. The technical evolution of HVAR employment continued throughout late 1944. Armament specialists developed improved fusing options that optimized warhead detonation for different target types. Contact fuses provided maximum armor penetration for direct hits. Proximity fuses, introduced in limited numbers by October, detonated warheads several feet above or beside targets, showering armored vehicles with fragments that could damage optics, antennas, and exposed equipment. Delay fuses allowed rockets to penetrate lighter structures before detonating, proving effective against bunkers and fortified positions. The training pipeline expanded to qualify more pilots in HVAR employment. By autumn 1944, newly arriving P-47 squadrons included rocket training as standard rather than specialized qualification. Pilots fresh from training schools in the United States arrived in Europe already familiar with rocket aiming techniques, having practiced against tank hulks and mock-ups at stateside ranges. This standardization meant that the 9th Air Force could assume HVAR capability across its entire fighter-bomber force rather than limiting rocket attacks to specialized units. German tactical responses evolved in parallel with American capabilities. Armored vehicles began moving in smaller increments, with individual tanks separated by several hundred yards rather than maintaining traditional formation intervals. This dispersion reduced the probability that multiple vehicles would be caught in a single attack, but also reduced mutual support and complicated command and control. Commanders had to choose between tactical coherence and survivability, a dilemma without satisfactory solution. The use of smoke to conceal movements provided limited benefit. Smoke screens effective against ground observation dissipated rapidly in wind or revealed vehicle positions through their very presence. Pilots learned to attack smoke concentrations, assuming they concealed valuable targets. Thermal effects from operating tank engines created signatures detectable through smoke, particularly during early morning or late afternoon when temperature differentials were greatest. The technology for thermal imaging would not arrive until decades later, but even visual observation could detect the shimmer of hot exhaust rising through smoke screens. German forces attempted to concentrate anti-aircraft assets to create no-fly zones over critical areas. This approach succeeded occasionally, particularly when defending prepared positions where flak guns could be pre-positioned and coordinated. But mobile warfare offered fewer opportunities for such concentration. The 40mm and 20mm weapons that comprised the bulk of German mobile anti-aircraft capability lacked the range to engage aircraft at the altitudes from which HVAR attacks typically commenced. By the time aircraft descended into effective flak range, They had already launched their rockets. The defensive fire might prevent follow-up strafing runs, but the primary attack had already occurred. The ammunition expenditure required for effective anti-aircraft defense exceeded available supply. German logistics, strained beyond capacity by simultaneous operations on multiple fronts, could not maintain adequate stockpiles of anti-aircraft ammunition forward deployed with armored units. A Wirbelwind Quad 20mm anti-aircraft tank carried 320 rounds per gun, sufficient for approximately 45 seconds of sustained fire. A typical HVAR attack from approach to completion lasted 12 to 15 seconds. The anti-aircraft vehicle needed to detect the threat, traverse to engage, and achieve effective fire all within that brief window. Even under ideal conditions, the probability of destroying or deterring an attacking P-47 remained low compared to the probability of the P-47 successfully delivering its rocket load. Final part. The Battle of the Bulge in December 1944 provided German armored forces one final opportunity to operate under conditions approaching air parity. Hitler's offensive, launched during a period of predicted bad weather, initially achieved surprise and significant penetration of American lines. For the first week, overcast skies and fog grounded Allied air power, allowing German armor to maneuver in daylight without fear of air attack. The offensive made substantial gains, capturing territory and destroying isolated American units. German commanders recognized this window as temporary, racing to achieve objectives before weather cleared and Allied fighter bombers returned to operation. On December 23, 1944, the weather broke. Clear skies returned across the Ardennes. Within hours, hundreds of P-47 Thunderbolts launched from bases in France and Belgium, vectored toward German armored columns now exposed on roads and in open terrain. The resulting carnage validated every lesson learned in France. German armor, concentrated for offensive operations rather than dispersed for defensive survival, presented targets of unprecedented density. American pilots, now veterans of 6 months of HVAR employment, executed attacks with systematic efficiency that left little to chance or luck. The 2nd Panzer Division, which had reached within 4 miles of the Meuse River and represented the deepest German penetration, found itself trapped between American ground forces, blocking further advance and relentless air attacks, destroying vehicles attempting withdrawal. Over December 24th and 25th, the division lost over 80% of its remaining armor, the majority to air attack. Survivors described a mechanical slaughter where vehicles simply exploded one after another as P-47 seconds worked methodically through the stalled columns. The division ceased to exist as a cohesive fighting force by December 26th, its wreckage scattered across 30 miles of Belgian roads and fields. Similar devastation occurred across the entire Bulge, salient as American air power, released after a week of enforced inactivity, fell upon German forces with accumulated fury. The 9th Air Force flew over 15,000 sorties between December 23rd and December 26th, with approximately 40% configured for ground attack with HVARs. The rocket expenditure during those 4 days exceeded 50,000 rounds, each delivering 60 pounds of high explosive against targets that could not effectively defend themselves or withdraw under fire. German after-action reports from the Ardennes offensive, compiled during January 1945, documented the primacy of air attack as the cause of operational failure. While inadequate fuel supply and stronger than expected American ground resistance contributed to the defeat, commanders uniformly identified air attack as the decisive factor preventing exploitation of initial successes. One report from 6th Panzer Army stated that armored operations in daylight had proven impossible once weather cleared, with vehicles forced to remain concealed during daylight hours and move only at night. This restriction reduced operational tempo to levels incompatible with offensive operations, effectively converting the German armored force into a stationary target awaiting destruction. The statistical record supports these assessments. During the Ardennes offensive, German forces committed approximately 1,000 armored vehicles, including tanks, assault guns, and tank destroyers. By mid-January 1945, when the offensive collapsed completely, approximately 600 of these vehicles had been lost. American and British ground forces claimed roughly 250 kills through direct combat. The remaining 350 losses, over half of total German armor, committed, resulted from air attack, mechanical failure during withdrawal, or abandonment when crews could not recover damaged vehicles under air threat. The HVAR-equipped fighter bomber had become the single most lethal threat to German armor, exceeding the kill rate of American and British tanks, tank destroyers, and towed anti-tank guns combined. The human cost of this transformation fell most heavily on German tank crews, who found themselves trapped inside machines that had become death traps rather than protected fighting positions. The survival rate for German armor crews in Western Europe during the last 9 months of the war was substantially lower than for infantry, reversing the traditional pattern where armored forces suffered fewer casualties than foot soldiers. Medical records from German field hospitals documented the types of injuries sustained in HVAR attacks: massive blast trauma, burns from fuel fires, crush injuries from turret mechanisms torn loose by internal explosions. The distinctive pattern of wounds allowed medical personnel to identify air attack victims without requiring explicit reports of how injuries occurred. The psychological casualties proved harder to quantify but no less real. Psychiatric evaluations of German POWs, captured after extensive exposure to air attack, documented symptoms consistent with what would later be termed post-traumatic stress disorder. Crews described hypervigilance, inability to sleep, panic reactions to aircraft sounds, and survivors' guilt over fallen comrades. These psychological wounds affected combat effectiveness, even among physically uninjured crews, manifesting in hesitancy to move vehicles, excessive caution that bordered on paralysis, and in extreme cases, outright refusal to crew armored vehicles. The technical sophistication of the HVAR system, while impressive by 1944 standards, represented merely the beginning of air-to-ground rocket development. Post-war analysis identified numerous potential improvements: improved guidance systems for precision targeting, larger warheads for enhanced destructive effect, longer-range rockets allowing attacks from outside anti-aircraft range. The unguided HVAR had demonstrated the concept's viability. Future developments would refine the weapon into increasingly lethal forms that would dominate ground attack aviation through the jet age and beyond. The broader implications extended beyond tactical effectiveness to strategic force employment. The HVAR demonstrated that air power, properly equipped and employed, could achieve battlefield effects previously requiring substantial ground forces. A fighter squadron equipped with rockets could accomplish in hours what might require days of ground combat, with attendant casualties and resource expenditure. This capability influenced post-war military doctrine across all Western armed forces, elevating close air support from supplementary role to core competency, requiring dedicated aircraft, specialized weapons, and intensive training. The German experience with American air power in general and HVARs specifically shaped Cold War Soviet military doctrine. Soviet military analysts studied the destruction of German armor in France and Germany, drawing lessons about the necessity of air defense and the vulnerability of armored forces without air superiority. The Soviet emphasis on mobile anti-aircraft systems accompanying armored formations, evident throughout the Cold War, derived directly from German failures to protect armor against air attack. Similarly, Soviet development of shoulder-fired surface-to-air missiles reflected recognition that ground forces required organic air defense capability rather than depending on fighter coverage that might not materialize. The industrial achievement, represented by HVAR production and deployment, deserves recognition alongside the weapon's tactical success. American industry transitioned from zero in production in early 1944 to over 100,000 units monthly by year's end, while simultaneously maintaining production of bombs, artillery shells, small arms ammunition, and every other munition required for global war. This industrial capacity, unmatched by any other belligerent, enabled American forces to employ weapons with a logistical lavishness that German forces could only envy. The ability to expend 90,000 rockets in 3 months of operations in France reflected industrial power as much as tactical sophistication. The training infrastructure that produced HVAR-qualified pilots represented another dimension of American systematic approach to military effectiveness. Training programs established standardized techniques, evaluated results through structured testing, and refined methods based on combat feedback transmitted from operational theaters. This cycle of training, evaluation, combat experience, and doctrinal refinement operated on timescales measured in months, continuously improving effectiveness while the war remained in progress. German training, disrupted by fuel shortages, Allied bombing, and simple attrition of experienced instructors, could not match this systematic approach to capability development. The final months of the war in Europe saw HVAR employment extend beyond tank killing to virtually every ground attack mission profile. Rockets proved effective against locomotives, allowing fighter bombers to interdict German rail traffic without the precision required for bombing. They destroyed bridges, particularly lighter structures that might survive near-miss bombs but collapsed under concentrated rocket fire. They suppressed fortified positions, cratering bunkers and destroying pillboxes that resisted conventional strafing. The versatility of the weapon system, combined with the P-47's ability to carry both rockets and bombs simultaneously, created a multi-role platform capable of addressing diverse targets in a single sortie. By April 1945, German armored forces had effectively ceased mobile operations in daylight anywhere American air power could reach. The final German formations defending along the Rhine, in Bavaria and in Czechoslovakia, moved only at night, sheltered in forests or villages during daylight, and attempted combat only when weather grounded Allied aircraft. This operational paralysis, as much as ground combat victories, contributed to the rapid collapse of German resistance in the war's final weeks. An army whose doctrine emphasized mobile warfare, combined arms integration, and offensive spirit had been reduced to static defense and night movement by an opponent who controlled the sky with absolute authority. The last recorded HVAR combat employment in Europe occurred on May 7, 1945, the day Germany surrendered unconditionally. A P-47 flight from the 362nd Fighter Group attacked German vehicles, attempting to flee into Austria ahead of Soviet forces. The rockets destroyed 3 trucks and damaged several staff cars. The crews, learning of the surrender while being processed as POWs, expressed bitter recognition that they had survived years of combat only to be hit hours before the war ended. The randomness that had characterized HVAR effectiveness throughout the campaign persisted to the final moments. Oberst Heinrich Freiherr von Luttwitz, whose shock at witnessing the first HVAR attacks in July 1944 had begun this narrative, survived the war. Captured by American forces in Bavaria during late April 1945, he participated in extensive debriefings about German armored operations and American tactical capabilities. His assessments, preserved in U.S. Army historical archives, acknowledged that German armored doctrine had proven fundamentally incompatible with operating environments where the enemy possessed complete air superiority. He specifically identified HVAR-equipped fighter bombers as the weapon system that had most decisively negated German armor's tactical advantages. A Panther might defeat 3 Shermans in direct combat, he observed, but no Panther could survive even one P-47 with a clear attack run. The transformation of the P-47 Thunderbolt from escort fighter to tank killer, with 60 pounds of explosives per rocket, represented more than tactical adaptation. It demonstrated American military culture's emphasis on identifying problems, developing solutions, and implementing changes rapidly enough to affect ongoing operations. The timeline from HVAR concept to mass deployment spanned less than 4 years. The learning curve from first combat employment to systematic doctrine occurred in 6 months. This organizational agility, combined with industrial capacity and training infrastructure, created military effectiveness that overwhelmed opponents, regardless of their tactical skill or technological sophistication in specific areas. For German soldiers who experienced HVAR attacks, the weapon came to symbolize the overwhelming material superiority that characterized American military power. The rockets themselves, terrible as they were, mattered less than what they represented: an opponent who could afford to fire 100,000 rockets in 3 months, who could train thousands of pilots in specialized employment techniques, who could deploy weapons systems from concept to frontline in timescales that German industry and military could no longer match. The 60 pounds of high explosive arriving faster than sound became the physical manifestation of industrial and organizational dominance that no amount of tactical excellence could overcome. The legacy of the HVAR extended beyond World War II into every subsequent conflict involving American air power. The rockets fired over France in summer 1944 were ancestors of the Hydra rockets used in Vietnam, the AGM-65 Mavericks employed in Desert Storm, and the precision-guided munitions that dominate contemporary close air support. Each generation improved accuracy, range, and destructive power, but the fundamental concept remained unchanged: transform fighter aircraft into flying artillery capable of destroying ground targets with precision and speed impossible for conventional weapons systems. The German tank crews who faced HVARs never expected Republic P-47 Thunderbolts to become tank killers, carrying weapons that delivered 60 pounds of explosives faster than sound and without warning. Their experience, documented in unit histories, after-action reports, and personal accounts, reveals the profound shock of confronting a weapon system that invalidated years of tactical development and operational experience. The machines they trusted to protect them became coffins. The tactics they had perfected became irrelevant. The supremacy they had enjoyed over Allied armor meant nothing when death arrived from above at 1,375 feet per second. In the final accounting, the HVAR did not win the war. No single weapon system could claim that distinction in a conflict of such scale and complexity. But the rocket transformed tactical equations in ways that accelerated German defeat and saved Allied lives. Every German tank destroyed by air attack was one fewer tank that American and British ground forces had to defeat in direct combat. Every German crew that abandoned vehicles rather than face HVAR-equipped Thunderbolts was one more crew that would not contest the advance to Germany. The cumulative effect of thousands of individual attacks, each delivering 60 pounds of high explosive against targets that could not effectively respond, contributed measurably to shortening the war and achieving Allied victory. The story that began with Oberst von Luttwitz's shock on July 25, 1944, concluded with German surrender 10 months later. In that interval, the HVAR-equipped P-47 had evolved from novel capability to standard weapon, from experimental system to decisive force multiplier. The German tank crews, who never expected fighter aircraft to carry such devastating firepower, learned through bitter experience that modern warfare rewarded industrial capacity and systematic innovation as much as tactical skill and operational art. Their defeat, written in the wreckage of hundreds of destroyed tanks across France, Belgium, and Germany, demonstrated that the side controlling the skies with sufficient numbers, appropriate weapons, and trained personnel would ultimately prevail regardless of ground force quality. The 60 pounds of explosives carried by each HVAR rocket, multiplied across hundreds of thousands of rounds fired over 11 months of combat, became the punctuation mark, ending the era of German armored dominance and beginning the age of air-ground integration that would define modern warfare.
Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now and don't forget to subscribe.